last time, when I do Bible classes, usually it's a series, and so these one-off lessons are lessons I've prepared in the past at some time. But we'll be looking at Jeremiah chapter 2, and this was once a lesson, a sermon, entitled here, The Cry of Jeremiah. And so we're going to spend our entire time in Jeremiah chapter 2. And the main point of our lesson this evening is going to be looking at what we can learn from God's relationship with Judah as we find it here in Jeremiah chapter 2. So if you'll go ahead and open up your Bibles there, I'm going to have my points on the screen, but I will not have the verses, so you have to follow along with me. But if someone wants to begin by reading Jeremiah chapter 2, 1 through 4. We're not going to read the entire chapter, just 1 through 4, and we'll cover these kind of a chunk at a time. So someone wants to read Jeremiah 2, 1 through 4. Okay, so the first few verses here, 1 through 4, I've entitled here, The Charge to Preach. And you have here in verses 1 and 2 of Jeremiah chapter 2, what I call the marching orders. And he says there, go and cry in the ears of Jerusalem. So go and tell these individuals, tell them this message he's going to give them. As we go through this chapter, we'll find that there is a case that's being brought up against Judah. And that, of course, is going to be involving sin. We continue there in this section 1 through 4. We find that God remembers their former conduct. If you look at the latter part of verse 2, he says, how thou wentest after me in the wilderness in a land that was not sown. He says, I remember for thee thy kindness of thy youth, the love of thy espousals, how thou wentest after me in the wilderness in a land that was not sown. And so he recalls their former faithful state. Now, if you think about that word in verse 2, remember, he says, I remember for thee these types of things. If he has to remember something, does that mean they are currently doing those things still? No. If something is ongoing, you don't remember it, it's still going on. So if he's remembering this, he's remembering their former faithful state, which implies they're not currently being faithful to him. We see there in verses 3 and 4, Israel's previous state before God. He says, Israel was holiness unto Jehovah, the first fruits of his increase. All that devour him shall be held guilty. Evil shall come upon them, saith Jehovah. And he tells them to hear the word of Jehovah. And so they were holy to God. They were first fruits to the Lord. And God's word, as we see there in verse 4, was to be heard and to be heeded by Israel. Now, I think we understand there's a difference between hearing God's word and heeding God's word, right? Heeding means what? If you hear and heed something, what are you doing? Paying attention. You're going to carry out what it is he's saying, right? He's hearing. So they are to hear and to be, his words are to be heard and to be heeded by Israel, to pay attention, to listen carefully to. Now our next section, someone wants to read verses 5 through 8 of Jeremiah chapter 2. Verses 5 through 8 of Jeremiah chapter 2, the case against Judah.
plentiful country to eat the fruits thereof and the good priests said not, "Where is the Lord?" And they that handled the law knew me not. The pastors also transgressed against me, and the prophets prophesied by Baal, and walked after the things that do not profit.
Okay, so as you look at verses 5 through 8, the case against Judah is what we find here. And as we look at verse 5, the question is asked here, what have I, that is God, done to deserve this treatment? And I think that's a very interesting way to think about an individual or a group of people or a nation, whatever it may be, that once was righteous and faithful, who no longer are. The question has to be asked, well, what, is there something that God has done that caused you to treat him this way? If you go back and look at verse 5, he says, "Thus saith Jehovah, what unrighteousness have your fathers found in me, that they are gone far from me, and have walked after vanity, and are become vain." So what thing have I done that have caused you to be unfaithful? Well, what is the answer to that question? It's a rhetorical question. We should know the answer to it. What is the answer to that question? Has God done anything to them that should cause them to do this?
Opposite, he's done everything for them.
Exactly, which we'll talk about as we get more into this. He has done nothing that should cause them to move away from him. And so the question is, well, if he hasn't done anything to cause him to do this, to act this way, then the question is, then why are you acting this way, right? Now, if you look at verse, and feel free to raise your hand, or if I don't see you, just throw something at me. Look at verse 6. In verse 6, they do not seek God who delivered them, there in verse 6. He says, "Neither said they, where is Jehovah that brought us up out of the land of Egypt?" And when I read that phrase, "neither said they, where is Jehovah that brought us up," it's basically the idea they're not looking to God for anything. They're not going to God in prayer. They're not seeking after him for any help, any type of aid. They're not turning to God. So they do not seek the God who delivered them, there in verse 6. Examples are given where God had delivered them. Despite this, God fed and watered them. Look at verse 6. He brought them up out of the land of Egypt, led us through the wilderness, through a land of deserts and pits, through a land of shadow and death, through a land that none passed through, where no man dwelt. And so he lists several things he has done for them. Then in verse 7 we find, verse 7 and 8, that God still was one who provided for them, right? God, as we look at verses 7 and 8, fulfilled his promises, but Judah did not. He says, "I brought you into a plentiful land to eat the fruit thereof and the goodness thereof, but when ye entered, ye defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination." And so how is God repaid for all the things he's done for them? As we see in verse 7, all the things he's done for them up to this point, how is God repaid with that as we look at verse 8, or latter part of verse 7 and verse 8? How is God repaid? Yeah. They were unfaithful to him. They gave him, as you've heard me say before, no credit for all the things he's done for them, right? You look at verse 7 there, he says, "But when ye entered, ye defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination." They committed spiritual adultery, right? Like what's pointed out there, that they cheated on God. They just turned away from him and turned to themselves, right? Because now we know they're going to talk, as we mentioned earlier, they would, as we'll talk about here in a second, actually, there in verse 8, they prophesied by Baal. Well, Baal doesn't exist. He was just something they created, and he was a false god. And, well, what are they doing? They're trusting actually in their own imagination, in their own creation. Look at verse 8. "The priest said not," so here are things that the priest did not say, "Where is Jehovah?" They never said that. They that handled the law knew me not. The rulers also transgressed against me, and the prophets prophesied by Baal, and walked after things, I notice, that do not profit. Now to walk after something is to do what? To seek it, to put your trust in it, right? He says, but what? They walk after things that do not profit. So did it do them any good? No. Yes.
That reminds me of the story of the farmer who did very well, tore down all his barns, and basically said, you know, look at all that I have done, basically.
Yeah.
And didn't really give God any credit.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, it's a very easy trap to fall into, that when things are going good, we pat ourselves on the back, but we don't give credit to God. And when things go bad, we blame God, but when things improve, we don't thank God. And so what do? Like I've said several times before, we give God all the blame, but none of the credit, right? Look now, someone wants to read now verses 9 through 13 of Jeremiah chapter 2. 9 through 13.
Therefore I will yet bring charges against you, saith the Lord, and against your children's children I will bring charges. For pass beyond the coast of Cyprus and the sea, send to Kedar, and consider diligently, and see if there has been such a thing. Has a nation changed its gods, which are not gods, but my people have changed their glory for what does not profit? Be astonished, O heavens, and be horribly afraid. Be very desolate, says the Lord.
Verse 13.
For my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewn themselves cisterns, broken cisterns, that can hold no water.
All right, thank you. So 9 through 13, we have evils committed by God's people, verses 9 through 13. As we look at verses 9 and 10, we see their rebellion grew, so does God's plea for them to return. Ignore my typos, 9 and 10. Wherefore I will yet contend with you, this American Standard says here, or have a charge against you, or a case against you, said Jehovah, with your children's children, and with your children's children will I contend. He says there in verse 10, for pass over to the isles of Kittim and see, and send unto Kedar, and consider diligently, and see if there hath been such a thing. So God is pleading with them. As their rebellion grew, he continues to plead with them. You know, God is a very patient and long-suffering God, right? And when we think about how long it took, I don't know exactly, before Noah was told to build an ark, right? We find there that he waited until the people could, the people were given a chance to right themselves, until you finally hear how he describes and has people whose their thoughts, their heart were only evil continually. Which means until they got to that point, they were given time to change. It didn't happen, and then we find the command given to Noah, right? Sodom and Gomorrah, no doubt, had warnings. Lot was there dwelling among them. He's referred to as righteous Lot. We know, I'm sure, as we think there in that context of Lot, how he begged those individuals not to do such things, especially when those messengers came, sent from the Lord came, and they wanted to know them carnally, and he asked them not to do those things. They were warned up until a certain point, and then we find that the wrath of God's going to come, right? And we find there in verses 9 and 10 how the rebellion grew, and God's pleas also grew with them. Look at verses 11 and 12. We have the rhetorical questions asked if they turn to gods that are not gods. He says, hath a nation changed its gods, which yet are no gods? So the question is, have they changed to other gods? Have they left me to follow after other gods? The answer is yes. Remember, the prophets are prophesying by Baal, right? They've gone after other gods. So the answer to that question is yes. He says, my people have changed their glory for that which doth not profit. Be astonished, he says there in verse 12, O ye heavens at this, and be horribly afraid. Be ye very desolate, saith Jehovah. So we find here his people have turned to gods that can do nothing, it does not profit. They are no help. No one has witnessed this type of evil that these have done there. It's kind of the idea there in verse 12 when he says, be astonished, O ye heavens at this, be horribly afraid, be ye very desolate, saith Jehovah. See what they're doing. What will we say sometimes today when you see, I have two older brothers, let me put it this way, and I learned a lot from the things they did and what happened as a result of them when they did those things. And I think about it this way and look at verse 12, see what they're doing, and now notice what's going to happen to them from me because of what they're doing. He says in verse 12, be astonished, O ye heavens, at this, and be horribly afraid. Be ye very desolate, saith Jehovah. And we think about this idea of, O ye heavens, that is everyone of every possible position, every possible leadership position, high or low, they all should what? Take note of what's going to happen. Now look at verse 13. Verse 13. We find there are two evils that are listed. He says, for my people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me. And then notice how he identifies himself, the fountain of living waters. So he makes it clear who he's talking about, the one true God. And have hewn them out cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. And so he compares them creating their gods to creating a big pot, a big container of water, or a big container to hold water that doesn't hold water, right? Can you imagine going to Lowe's and buying one of their blue buckets and it has holes in the bottom and you just buy it anyway? You think, oh, it'll work. It doesn't work. Yeah.
So is that why the brethren are supposed to leave? Because the cistern don't hold no water?
Yes. Nice.
That took me a second.
It took me a second too. Thank you. Not exactly, but thank you for that. It's like, what are you talking? Okay. Anyway, these containers that they were making for them, he compares their false gods to them creating containers to hold water that doesn't hold water. False gods can hold no hope, right? That's the idea there in verse 13. That hold no water. And so if the water is hope or salvation or whatever it may be, their false gods hold none of that, right? They forsook him who's a fountain of living waters. They forsook God for cisterns that leak and cannot hold waters. And so they put their faith in things that do them no good. As he says earlier, that provide no profit for them, right? Going back to into verse 11, for that which doth not profit. And so we think about that idea. He's saying you've left your source of hope and you're gone after and you made yourself these false gods that can hold no hope, no salvation, none of that. Yes?
It's amazing to me how the same people that they had defeated and those gods, they want to be like them. And the other thing is they want to be like the people around them and have kings. And they defeated those people, and yet they want to be like them.
Yeah.
Makes no sense.
Yeah. And we still see that today when brethren, sometimes, if we're not careful, we look around and we see what other people are doing, and we say, well, we want to be like them. We look at the denominations are doing sometimes, we say, oh, well, let's do what they're doing. What happens? Well, it's a broken pot, isn't it? It doesn't hold any hope. And definitely it is something we have to be careful of. Like you said, they were doing things that those who they have already defeated were guilty of doing before. We can, if we call someone out for a sin and they repent of it, and then we 2 weeks later are guilty of the same thing, we're not helping ourselves at all, are we? And here they have defeated these people, like you were saying, who were doing some of these same things, and now here they are doing exactly the same thing. Let's look now at verses, someone wants to read 14 through 19 of Jeremiah chapter 2. 14.
Hey, Russ.
Yes.
Gary had a very good point there, because you take, for example, the gods that they once spoke against, the gods that they were told to stay away from, the gods that they had built up in their mind and even carved images of and things like that, could not help them. It's like you said, whenever we see somebody else, and even religiously, it seems like maybe they're doing something right because they're getting the masses or they're getting individuals, and we might say, well, let's try that. Why would we try it? God gives us the method. He gives us the way. He gives us the book. He gives us everything we need to convert a soul, to bring them to Christ. I know Noah only taught one good news for the people to come to. He built one ark. He didn't build 10. He didn't just go try this or try that. God gave him a message. And so whenever we go out and try to heap into ourselves ideas from man, it's going to fail every time.
Yeah. And we think about what's happening here. What they're doing is not by accident. These are things that they have chosen to do. They had to work at it. It's a plan that they were doing, that they were executing. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. No priest or no prophets were even considering God. And so, any plan that leaves out God, and that's what they're doing, they're leaving out God, that deserves to fail. And that's what's happening here. They're leaving God out. And what's happening? Everything is failing around them. But they don't call out to God. They don't go to God. They don't remember all the things that God has done for them. And I think sometimes we're not careful that we as, not just as human beings, but as Christians, can have very short memories when we think about all the things that God has done for us. Because when bad things or difficult times come or bad things happen sometimes to us or to our families, sometimes we can forget what God has done for us. All those times in the past, and we think, well, how am I going to get through this? The same way we've gotten through every other day in our life, right? With God. And so we have to make sure that we don't have that short-term memory that we find so many times, especially in the Old Testament. Okay, 14 through 19. I think any verse that has the word cistern in it now, I think Jake should have to read it. 14 through 19. Someone to read that for me, please.
Is Israel a servant? Is he homeborn slave? Why is he spoiled? The young lions roared upon him and yelled, and they made his land waste. His cities are burned without inhabitants. Also the children of Noth and Phoenix have broken the crown of the head. Hast thou not procured this unto thyself in that which thou hast forsaken the Lord thy God, when he led thee by the way? And now what hast thou to do in the way of Egypt, to drink the waters of Sinai, or that which hast that? And what hast thou to do in the way of Assyria, to drink the waters of the river? Thine own wickedness shall correct thee, and thy backslidings shall reprove thee. Know therefore and see that which is evil, an evil thing, and bitter, and that hast forsaken the Lord thy God. And for thy fear is not of thee, said the Lord God of hosts.
Okay, so as we look here at 14 through 19, we have the coming punishment and why. We have 14 through 18, the reason for all their trouble is traced back to them having forsaken God, right? He asks, he begins there with a question there in verse 14, and he talks about how, he says, the young lions have roared upon him and yelled. They have made his land waste. His cities are burned up without inhabitant. All these different things. The children of these two, Memphis and Taphanes, have broken the crown of thy head. Hast thou not, notice verse 17, hast thou not procured this unto thyself? You ever hear someone say, well, you did it to yourself? I heard that a lot when I was a kid. I don't care about how many times I heard it, but I heard that a lot. When you did it to yourself, it's your own fault, right? And that's the idea we find there in verse 17. Hast thou not procured this unto thyself? The things they're going to endure because of what they have done, how they have walked away from God, they've all done it themselves. No one has made them do this. Remember, the very first few verses of chapter 2 deals with God saying, what have I done to make you do this? Well, the answer is nothing. We're just what? We just decided to walk away, basically, right? They're going to create their own gods. They're going to prophesy according to their own gods. And what happens? Well, everything just implodes, right? Verse 17, in that thou hast forsaken Jehovah thy God when he led thee by the way. So he asked that question, hast thou not procured this? Have you not done this to yourself when you've forsaken God, right? That's the idea there in verse 17. And now what hast thou to do in the way to Egypt, to drink the waters of Shihor, or what hast thou to do in the way of Syria, to drink the waters of the river? And so we find in verses 14 through 18, they have brought all these things upon them, and now we find in verse 18 and 19 here, that God was going to do what? He's going to punish them, right? They brought all these things upon themselves, 17 and 18 really. In verse 19, it was wrong for them to forsake God and not fear him. You see there in verse 19, thine own wickedness shall correct thee, and thy backsliding shall reprove thee. Now therefore, and see that it is an evil thing in a bitter, that thou hast forsaken Jehovah thy God, and that my fear is not in thee, saith the Lord, Jehovah of hosts. Now I want us to notice a few things here in verse 19 before we move on. He says, thy own wickedness shall correct thee. When we think upon our own lives on a daily basis, when we examine ourselves, we're going to find things that maybe we need to do better, or things that we're going to find that we might say, you know what, I need to remove that from my life because it's not doing me any good, and maybe it's just flat out sin, right? He says in verse 19, thine own wickedness shall correct thee, and thy backslidings shall reprove thee. The error of your own ways, you might say this, are going to come home to roost, as we say, right? You reap what you sow. What's happening? They're doing evil. They're departing from God. What happens? They're reaping what they're sowing. And so they're going to reap because of all their own backslidings. He says here, know therefore, and see that it is an evil thing and a bitter, that thou hast forsaken Jehovah thy God. So it's not just an evil thing, it's a bitter thing. It's interesting that you have those two terms there in verse 19 that talks about how God feels about how they are treating him. He says it's not just an evil thing, it's bitter. You ever have someone or something happen to you, you think, you know, that just leaves a bad taste in my mouth? What they're doing to God was no doubt leaving a bad taste in his mouth, wasn't it? They have forsaken him. They are treating him in a very bitter, unfair, unjustifiable reason. They're treating him the way they are. And then we find here at the latter part of verse 19, he says here, if thou hast forsaken Jehovah thy God, so that's the evil and bitter thing, and that my fear is not in thee. Why? What's one of the reasons they're acting this way? Because they do not fear God. They do not fear God. Do people today truly believe in the judgment day? We talk about it, we preach it, we have Bible classes on it, but I'm convinced that people really believe there's going to be a day when Christ comes back, he's going to judge the living and the dead. We'd have to find more seats. But people today do not fear God as they should. Whether we're talking about Christians or non-Christians, so obviously they don't. But sometimes we have those who seem by their actions to not really believe the judgment day is coming, because there's not enough fear for them to believe and to act and to live as they should, right? Look there in verse 19. That my fear is not in thee, saith the Lord Jehovah of hosts. You're acting this way. Why? Because you don't fear me. Let's read next verses 20 through 30. So I'm going to read that. Jeremiah 2, 20 through 30.
For of old I have broken your yoke and burst your bonds. And you said, I will not transgress. But on every hill and under every green tree you lay down plain and harlot. Yet I have planted you a noble vine, a seed of highest quality. How then have you turned before me into the degenerate plant of an alien vine? Though you wash yourself with lye and use much soap, yet your iniquity is marked before me, says the Lord God. How can you say, I am not polluted? I have not gone after the Baals. See your way in the valley. Know what you have done. You are a swift dromedary breaking loose in her way. A wild donkey used to the wilderness, that sniffs at the wind in her desire. In her time of mating, who can turn her away? All those who seek her will not weary themselves. In her month, they will find her. Withhold your foot from being unshod and your throat from thirst. But you said, there is no hope. No, for I have loved aliens, and after them I will go. As a thief's ashamed when he is found out, so is the house of Israel ashamed. They and their kings and their princes and their priests and their prophets. saying to a tree, you are my father, and to a stone, you gave birth to me. For they have turned their back to me, and not their face. But in the time of their trouble, they will say, arise and save us. But where are your gods that you have made for yourselves? Let them arise, if they can save you in the time of your trouble. For according to the number of your cities are your gods, O Judah. Why will you fear you? You all have transgressed against you, says the Lord. In vain I have chastened your children. They receive no correction. Your sword has devoured your prophets like a destroying lion.
Okay. So as we look at verse 20 through 30, we have Judah's massive idolatry. You might say also their massive denial as we go through this as well. In the first part of verse 20, we find that God broke their bonds of slavery in the past. He says, For of old time I have broken thy yoke and burst thy bonds. Means God has helped them in times past, as we've already mentioned. But now we find in verse 20, he says, And thou saidest, I will not serve, for upon every high hill and under every green tree thou didst bow thyself, playing the harlot. And so he does all these things for them, but what is their response? They turn from God despite God giving them the very best, as we look at verse 20 through 22. And so he blesses them, he is with them, and their reply is just more unfaithfulness, more idolatry. He says there in verse 20 how they would not serve. Verse 21, Yet I planted thee a noble vine, holy, a right seed. How then art thou turned into the degenerate branches of a foreign vine unto me? And you look at verse 21, that's a pretty strong way to describe that you have turned from what is holy and good to that which is worthless, right? He says, How then art thou turned into the degenerate branches of a foreign vine? That is a turning to a worthless, false god that can do nothing. Verse 22, For though thou wash thee with lye and take thee much soap, yet thine iniquity is marked before me, saith the Lord Jehovah. So what happens in verse 22? Their stains, we might say, were so deep they would not be easily removed. Why? Because they have to turn from it, right? You picture the idea of them scrubbing off, trying to scrub it off, and what happens? Well, they haven't truly repented, so the sin is still remaining, right? We continue on there, verses 23 through 25. They love sin and look for it like a wild animal sniffing the wind. He says there in verse 23, How canst thou say, I am not defiled, I have not gone after the Balaam, and see thy way in the valley, know what thou hast done, thou art a swift dromedary traversing her ways. He talks about how they have what? They have not turned from doing their wickedness. We continue on here. We're going to try to move a little more quickly here. And the next section here, their false gods cannot help them in times of trouble, verses 26 through 28. He says there, as the thief is ashamed when he is found, so is the house of Israel ashamed. Their kings, their princes, and their priests, and their prophets who say to a stock, Thou art my father. What are they doing? They're turning to everything but God, right? To everything but God. Verse 28, But where are thy gods that hast made thee? Let them arise if they can save thee in the time of thy trouble. So we have the question there from God, where are your gods who you saying have created you, right? As we saw previously. Let them save you, right? Wherefore will ye contend with me? Ye all have transgressed against me, saith Jehovah. In vain I have smitten your children, they receive no correction. Your own sword hath devoured your prophets like a destroying lion. What's happening? They're not turning away from their sin, right? He's smitten them, he's tried to correct them, but they would have nothing to do with it, right? They received no correction. Verse 30. Now 31 through 37, our last section here, is God had been forgotten for so long. Now I'm going to read this one, 31 through 37. O generation, see ye the word of Jehovah. Have I been a wilderness unto Israel, or a land of thick darkness? Wherefore say my people, we are broken loose, we will come no more unto thee. Can a virgin forget her ornaments, or a bride her attire? Yet my people have forgotten me days without number. How trimmest thou thy way to seek love? Therefore even the wicked woman hast thou taught thy ways. Also in thy skirts is found innocent, and thy skirt is found the blood of the souls of the innocent poor. Thou dost not find them breaking in, but it is because of all these things. Yet thou saidest, I am innocent. Surely his anger is turned away from me. Behold, I'll enter into judgment with thee, because thou sayest, I have not sinned. Why gaddest thou about so much to change thy way? Thou shalt be ashamed of Egypt, also as thou wast ashamed of Assyria. From thence also shalt thou go forth with thy hands upon thy head, for Jehovah hath rejected those in whom thou trustest, and thou shalt not prosper with them. 30 through 37, God had been forgotten for so long. God had blessed them. They have not gone without, as we find there in verse 31. Yet they forgot God long ago. Look at verse 32. He says, yet my people have forgotten me days without number. That means it's been a long time since they've come back to God. What they've been doing has been going on for a while. It shows you God's patience and long suffering, doesn't it? Days without number. I don't know how long that is, but it's been a long time. So you can't say God is impatient, because he most definitely is. 30 through 35, we find they have taught others their sinful ways, and their sin cannot be hidden. They have taught others their sinful ways. We can either pass down the ways of righteousness, or we can pass down the ways of rebellion. And that's what they were doing, passing down the ways of rebellion and sin. And there in verse 33 through 35. In the last two verses, we find their sin was easily seen, no search was necessary. They have not changed. Verse 36, and their alliances with others have been short-lived. There was no help for them, right? Their allies could not help, as we see also there in the latter part of verse 37. They were in sin. Look with me for just a second in verse 35. The latter part of verse 35, behold, I'll enter into judgment with thee, because thou sayest, I have not sinned. They're denying their sin. Now we're out of time. 2 lessons for us today, and then I'll be quiet. Being faithful to God in the past is not enough, right? Verses 1 through 3 of Jeremiah chapter 2. They were faithful in the past, but something had changed. Secondly, denying the sinful behavior does not work with God. Verse 29, verse 35 here. So past faithfulness is just that, past faithfulness. All right, any comments or questions before we close? That was quick because we ran out of time. Thank you for your time and for your attention.